Hello and welcome to Rick's RC Flying channel. In this video, we're going to look at strengthening the center section of a balsa wing by using fiberglass cloth and epoxy resin. Now, the weight of this fiberglass cloth, I was going to use 6-ounce cloth, but I decided to bring it right down to just under 3-ounce cloth. It's a fairly good quality fiberglass cloth, has a very nice tight weave, and make sure you have very sharp scissors so when you cut the fiberglass cloth to the size you need, you've got clean, straight edges to eliminate as much fraying as you possibly can. The front part of the fiberglass cloth, which is a straight edge, is going to go about halfway up the leading edge. This one here is going to be trimmed right on this edge of the trailing edge. I always do the bottom first, and the top cloth is the one that does any overlapping. And so the front top cloth will come and overlap the bottom leading edge slightly by about 1/4 inch. And the back here, the top cloth is actually going to come up this part, and it's going to be cut on the same line. This makes for very clean look. And I'm using the West System epoxy resin. Another little thing I do, and I mentioned it in another video where I talk about and show how to make a fiberglass cowling, is I use thin CA glue and I apply it at the upper section of a brush, and a fairly liberal amount depending on the thickness of the brush, so it kind of soaks in there. And the reason I do that, it just drives me crazy when any of these strands come out while I'm working with it. And for the most part, it pretty much eliminates ever these thistles coming off while you're working with it. Now, the other thing I've done is I put masking tape here. So as I apply the fiberglass cloth, I end up with a clean, straight edge. If I didn't do that, as you're brushing, you end up with sort of an irregular line that you're making with the resin, and it just makes finishing a little more awkward when you're doing the final finishing of the airplane. So by having at least a straight edge, any feathering you're doing, you're working, with a much better line, to say. So I'm using a slow hardener to afford me the working time. And you start in the center and work out. And really soak it in there.
Now, as you're applying this resin, make sure that you apply enough resin on that the surface has sort of a shiny, glossy look. Now, of course, the wood and the fiberglass cloth will be absorbing the resin, and as it does, there'll be certain areas that'll have that non-glossy look. Simply apply more resin to it. Not to worry about the excess resin that's on top of the fiberglass cloth, because we will be removing it. So now I'm just inspecting the surface just to make sure that the entire surface has a wet, glossy, shiny look. You can actually see that in the video. So now I'm preparing to remove the excess resin that is basically sitting on top of the fiberglass cloth. And we're going to use bathroom tissue. It's inexpensive and does a great job soaking up the resin that is actually sitting on top of the fiberglass cloth. By putting a liberal amount on initially, we know the wood has absorbed it and that the fiberglass cloth is soaked in it. But to make the whole finishing process easier and to end up with a really super smooth surface, it's imperative to remove the excess resin that is sitting on top of the fiberglass cloth. Now, as you apply the bathroom tissue onto the surface, you can lightly pat it down. This just helps it absorb the resin. Now, we'll be doing this at least one more time. And just depending how much resin is on top and how thick the fiberglass cloth initially was, you may have to even do it a third time. Now you don't have to wait very long, before removing the bathroom tissue, because you can see once it's basically absorbed the resin as it has now, you can begin the process of removing the bathroom tissue. Now, as we remove the tissue paper, you'll still see resin sitting on top of the fiberglass cloth, and this is very typical after just the first application of the tissue paper. And that's why we're going to be doing it a second time, and you'll notice quite a difference. Now, as you apply the second application of the bathroom tissue paper, you can see that it's not absorbing as much as it initially did because we have removed quite a bit. But the second application is important, and you will notice quite a difference when you remove it. The fiberglass cloth will have a very smooth satin look to it. Now, once you have the second layer on, it's a good idea to go around and do some light patting down. It just helps absorb the resin off the surface, particularly if there happens to be a slightly low spot somewhere. So after about a minute or so, you'll be able to tell when it's basically stopped absorbing any resin. You can remove the tissue paper. Now, once the tissue paper is removed, carefully look at the surface, and if you see any shiny, glossy areas, take some of the tissue paper and just blotch those areas because ultimately you want that consistent flat satin look, which assures that you've removed all of the resin off the surface. So once you're satisfied that you removed all the resin from the surface, you can then remove the masking tape. Now here I'm just checking to make sure the fiberglass cloth is wet with resin past the trim cut line. This way, once it hardens and you go to do the trim cut on the trailing edge, you'll end up with a very clean, sharp edge without any fraying, and it'll be much easier.
Now we have the top surface has now been finished as well. Previously we did the bottom surface, which has cured overnight. And the top surface was applied exactly the same. It's basically one coating of a epoxy resin. And as you saw previously, then the excess resin, after it's soaked into the fabric, the resin that stays on top of the fiberglass cloth gets removed. And as you saw, I used the toilet paper. And one reason I use it, it absorbs very well and it's very inexpensive. And so you end up with a really nice smooth finish. And for what it's worth, the product I use, we'll just mention a few things about it. I'm not sponsored by anybody, so it's just the product I chose to use. And as I mentioned earlier, it's called West Systems. I use the 105 epoxy resin. And the reason I like using epoxy resin, and particularly West System, it levels off nicely, it sands easily, and is extremely strong. And as a matter of fact, if you build model boats, it's even waterproof. It can be used below the waterline. And the other thing I like about epoxy resin versus fiberglass resin, uh, particularly like when I make fiberglass cowlings, is it's more flexible and it's also easy to repair with it. So, if you epoxy resin something and you're going to fix it, just use epoxy resin and it works very well. And although I will have to say, West System epoxy resin is rather expensive. However, though, the way I use it, as you saw, I only use one application. It's one layer, which also keeps the weight down. And so it goes a long way. And this has a shelf life, the resin, of about 3 years. And I use the 105, which generally in all the modeling work I do, whether it's center section reinforcing or even making a fiberglass cowling, as I said, I like it because it's flexible. I use the 105. They make other formulas which you can check online for more specialized applications. And it comes with different hardener formulas. For example, the one I used here, because I wanted a little more time to work with, so I use what they call the slow hardener, which is designated as 206. And it has a pot life of about 20 to 25 minutes. And but once you start applying it, I mean, you can easily work an hour with it. It takes 10 to 15 hours to cure. So I use that for bigger projects, just to afford me more time. The other thing is, you'll notice it has these pump uh, applicators here, and the ratio that they're mixed with is 1 to 1. So depending on how much you need, if you pump this 3 times, you do this 3 times. So you basically can't go wrong. So I really like the convenience of that. And these are made by West System as well. So this was the slow hardener I used. They also make one which is called the fast hardener, and it's referred to as 205. And I use this actually more times than not for anything of the smaller projects. And now this has a pot life of about 9 to 12 minutes. And I mean, you can work with it longer once you start applying it somewhere. And it takes about 6 to 8 hours to cure. So, it's definitely faster if time is important to you that way. If you need to clean up, or even if you like to thinnen it out, I use lacquer, works really well. You could use acetone as well. The other thing I like about West Systems, uh, there's no odor. I mean, you can't smell anything. Now, of course, there are some modelers, and I understand too, they work with fiberglass resin, whereas I was using epoxy resin. Now, fiberglass resin is more brittle. Now, although this one here, which is commonly used in a lot of automotive work and boats, um, and just about anything else you could use it on, it costs about 1/3 or half of what West System does. I find that it's a little heavier. It's a little harder to sand. So for me, it's not my personal preference to work with, uh, although I know there's a lot of modelers that do. So um, as I mentioned, uh, it does go a long way, especially the way I apply it. Like I said, this lasts about 3 years in the can, they say. The hardeners is about 2 years. So if you apply it this way, and you put basically one layer on, uh, boy, you sure can cover or do a lot of projects with it. Anyways, that's where we're at. We're done with reinforcing the center section. And the next step is now going to be doing some final sanding, going to feather the edge out a bit, and then start preparing the wing to cover it with the fabric, which will be an entirely separate video. So as always, if you have any comments or questions, I always welcome them. If you enjoyed the video, please select like and subscribe. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.